Rome was beautiful, and that's what made it so disturbing. It gave the world roads, laws, language, things we still rely on today. But under the marble and ceremony, something else was growing, something darker. Because the Roman Empire didn't just conquer with swords, it ruled with rituals. It used the body as currency, and it turned sexuality into a system of control so twisted it makes modern scandals look almost innocent. These weren't private acts hidden behind curtains. They were laws, ceremonies, performances. An emperor marrying a boy and calling him empress. A palace turned into a brothel for senators' wives. Public orgies disguised as religious festivals. Children raised not for love, but for ritual sacrifice. And the most terrifying part, none of it was considered abnormal. This isn't just a list of bizarre behaviors, it's a map of how power corrupts, how shame dissolves, and how empires rot from the inside, one ritual at a time. So if you think morality is slipping today, wait until you see where we learned it from. This isn't just ancient history, it's where we are now. When Caligula became emperor, the people of Rome rejoiced. He was young, charming, and came from a beloved bloodline. After years of political instability and distrust, many believed his rise to power would bring a return to order, even glory. For a brief moment, it felt as if Rome had found its golden boy. But the light didn't last. Within his first year on the throne, something changed. People noticed it in quiet moments at first. Trusted advisors removed from their posts, new laws passed without explanation, loyal generals quietly reassigned. The palace, once a symbol of tradition and power, began to feel unpredictable. And soon Caligula's personal behavior stopped being a private matter. It became the center of everything. He didn't hide what he was doing, he displayed it, openly, proudly. Caligula brought his 3 sisters into the palace and began treating them not as family, but as lovers. At public banquets, he seated them in places meant for his wife. No one questioned it, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. In Caligula's Rome, silence wasn't just safer, it was required. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess. Then he made mourning her a matter of law. For days, it became illegal to laugh, to share meals with loved ones, even to bathe. Citizens were arrested for smiling. What had once been private grief became a public performance, one with strict rules and harsh punishments. But the most disturbing turn came when Caligula transformed the imperial palace into something no one could have imagined, a brothel. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't hidden in shadow, it was real. And it was state-sponsored. He filled it with the wives and daughters of Rome's most powerful men, forcing them to serve guests like common prostitutes. Senators were summoned and made to watch as their own families were used for the emperor's entertainment. Some wept, some begged, but resistance meant punishment, not just for them, but for their bloodlines. Then Caligula began charging admission. He turned humiliation into income. The deeper the shame, the higher the price. And with every coin collected, the message became clearer. Nothing in Rome was sacred, not marriage, not family, not even the body itself. For Caligula, sex was never about desire, it was about power. Every act he commanded, every ritual he forced upon his subjects was a reminder that he ruled not just their land, but their most intimate moments. Your wife didn't belong to you, your dignity didn't belong to you, everything belonged to him. And still, he pushed further. One day, Caligula announced that his favorite horse would be made consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. At first, people laughed. Surely this was theatre, a moment of madness. But it wasn't. He gave the horse a marble stable, golden feed, and servants. It wasn't a joke, it was a threat. By promoting a horse, Caligula was saying the quiet part out loud, that Rome's highest office meant nothing, that the senators were just decorations, and that if a man could not control his own household, his own name, or his own wife, he certainly couldn't control the emperor. This wasn't madness, it was strategy. Caligula ruled through fear. His performances were deliberate. They weren't fueled by pleasure alone, they were powered by domination. The more shame he could cause, the more control he had. He didn't want applause, he wanted surrender. And the most terrifying part, the empire still functioned. Taxes were collected, soldiers followed orders, roads were built. Rome looked strong from the outside. But inside, it was crumbling. Because rot doesn't destroy the foundation all at once. It works in silence, behind the walls, eating through the heart of everything that holds a place together. That's what Caligula became, the slow rot of Rome, one law at a time, one body at a time. Eventually, even his own guards could no longer bear it. In the 4th year of his reign, they found him alone in the palace corridors. They didn't give a speech. They didn't wait for approval. They ended it. Rome called it justice. Some called it mercy. But by then, the damage had already spread. The palace had become a stage, sex had become law, and shame had become a tool of the state. Caligula proved something that frightened even his enemies. An emperor didn't need wisdom. He didn't need love or truth or loyalty. He only needed fear and a crowd too afraid to look away. If Caligula broke the rules of power, then Elagabalus tore them apart completely. Before we continue, if this story has reminded you of anything that feels familiar in today's world, leave a comment below. I read all of them. And if you're still watching, maybe consider liking the video. It tells me you're listening and that this matters. He didn't just twist the values of Roman society, he reversed them. Morality, gender, religion, everything was up for redesign. And he didn't do it quietly. He did it in robes, in temples, in public parades, because for Elagabalus, shame wasn't something to avoid, it was something to conquer. He was only 14 when he became emperor. Still a teenager. Still learning how the world worked. But he didn't learn from senators or generals. He followed different teachers, priests, astrologers, dancers, and lovers. His world didn't revolve around war or politics, it revolved around self-invention. From the moment he entered Rome, people knew this emperor would be different. He arrived dressed not as a soldier, but as a priest, draped in silk, painted with makeup, adorned with jewelry. He wore perfume instead of armor. And rather than stand tall as a Roman man, he moved through the palace with the grace of a courtesan. It confused people at first. Then it frightened them. Elagabalus didn't just blur the lines of gender, he stepped right over them. He asked to be called by feminine titles. He referred to himself as a wife, not a husband. According to ancient sources, he offered large rewards to any physician who could give him a woman's body. What we'd now call gender confirmation surgery, he saw as divine transformation. But this wasn't private, it wasn't personal. It was a message. If the emperor could become a woman, if the emperor could marry a man in public, then what else could be changed? What else could be unmade? He married a chariot driver named Heracles and called him his husband. He insisted on being the submissive partner in the relationship and treated Heracles as Rome's true protector. At official ceremonies, Elagabalus appeared beside him, not as ruler and servant, but as wife and groom. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. In a society where dominance was the highest virtue and masculinity the measure of worth, Elagabalus was a revolution in flesh, and revolutions terrify empires. But gender wasn't the only rule he rewrote. He desecrated one of Rome's most sacred religious taboos by marrying a Vestal virgin, a woman sworn to 30 years of chastity. Her purity was believed to protect the state itself. By taking her as a bride, Elagabalus declared not just love, but war against tradition, against Rome's gods, and against its moral center. And still he didn't stop. He brought with him a foreign god from Syria, Elagabalus, and built a temple in its honor, placing this eastern deity above Jupiter, above Mars, above all Roman gods. He called himself the living high priest. He danced in front of altars dressed in golden gowns, offering sacrifices in what many saw as madness and blasphemy. He declared that all religions should submit to his God, that Rome's centuries-old faith should be folded beneath the robes of a teenage emperor wearing eyeliner. And if that weren't enough, he opened the palace doors for a kind of worship no temple had seen before. He turned sacred ritual into sexual theatre. Not hidden, not ashamed, but open, daily, and structured like performance. He hired actors and priests to participate in elaborate ceremonies that combined faith and physical pleasure, publicly, often deliberately. The message was clear. If the gods desired him, who could question it? Some say he even worked in the palace as a prostitute, not in disguise, but in full regalia. He stood in palace corridors offering himself to strangers, sometimes for coin, sometimes for spectacle. He wasn't pretending, he was redefining power. The emperor wasn't just untouchable, he was, in his mind, divine, because he had touched everything. Elagabalus didn't seek approval, he wanted surrender. And that's what frightened the senators more than anything else, not the gowns, not the gods, not the men he married, but the fact that he stopped pretending. He no longer performed power as tradition demanded. He performed it on his own terms. And by doing so, he revealed the empire's greatest fear. That control was only an illusion. That if enough people refused to play the game, the rules meant nothing. But Rome wasn't ready to lose the game. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own elite soldiers, grew tired of the chaos. Religious leaders saw their influence crumbling, senators whispered behind doors, and in the end, as so often happens, the ones who put him in power were the ones who took him down. At just 18 years old, Elagabalus was murdered by his guards. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. His memory was erased from public records. His name was forbidden from being spoken. Rome tried to scrub him from history. But the truth was harder to kill. Elagabalus showed that even in the heart of a brutal empire, identity could still defy expectation. That power wasn't always masculine. That control didn't always look like a sword. It could look like a silk dress. And even though the empire moved on, it never fully healed. Because once power becomes performance, it doesn't stop. It only changes costumes. By the time Nero became emperor, Rome was already bruised. The empire had seen madness. It had seen cruelty. But it had never seen anything quite like Nero. He didn't come to power through violence. He came through charm and influence, guided by his mother Agrippina, a woman as ambitious as any general. At first, he seemed promising. He loved music, theatre, poetry. He performed for friends, wrote songs, even dreamed of becoming a great actor. But Rome didn't need an actor. It needed a leader. And Nero couldn't separate the two. What began as a passion for performance soon bled into every part of his reign. He didn't just want applause from the stage. He wanted it from the Senate, the soldiers, the gods. If they didn't cheer, they didn't deserve to live. He turned the empire into an audience, and himself into the only act worth watching. Unlike Caligula or Elagabalus, Nero didn't hide behind religion or ritual. He made performance his weapon, not behind closed doors, but on Rome's biggest stages. He married a young boy named Sporus, had him castrated, and then held a public wedding. Sporus wore a bridal gown. Nero wore a crown. They exchanged vows, celebrated with music, and lived as husband and wife before the eyes of Rome. Later, he married another man named Pythagoras, but this time Nero played the bride. He dressed in lace and ceremony and called himself the wife. The roles flipped, the lines blurred, and the empire watched in silence. But silence in Rome wasn't safety. It was survival. No one could look away, not because they wanted to watch, but because looking away was dangerous. Nero didn't just blur gender, he blurred dignity. His court became a theatre, his decisions, rehearsals, his punishments, performances. He staged mock marriages between animals and humans. He invited nobles to feasts that turned into orgies. He acted in plays where the lines were real and the stakes were death. Sometimes the blood on stage wasn't fake and the screams weren't scripted, but he saved his most twisted scenes for the people he claimed to love. His relationship with his mother, Agrippina, was the subject of rumor and fear. Some said they shared a bed, others said she controlled him completely. Whatever the truth, Nero eventually ordered her death. First, he tried to sink her ship. When that failed, he sent assassins. He wept when it was over. But by then, the applause had become more important than grief. With every passing year, Nero craved a bigger stage. He performed for thousands in amphitheaters, forcing senators and soldiers to sit for hours, watching him sing and strum. They clapped with bleeding hands, not because he was good, but because he was emperor. And then came the fire. In 64 AD, a blaze consumed much of Rome. While the city burned, Nero was rumored to have stood on his balcony playing the lyre and reciting lines from Greek tragedy. He didn't mourn the city. He rebuilt it in his image. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House, rose from the ashes, a palace of unimaginable luxury with rotating dining rooms, fountains that sprayed perfume, and walls of gold leaf. But it wasn't built for function. It was built for theatre. Nero hadn't just made sex and performance tools of power. He had made reality itself bend to his fantasy. Those who opposed him disappeared. Those who served him had to laugh on cue, cry on command, and die without complaint. And the people, they endured. Because Rome had learned something dangerous. A man with enough charm, enough pageantry, and enough cruelty could rule not with justice, but with performance. But even the greatest acts must end. As rebellions grew and alliances crumbled, Nero lost his grip on the audience. He fled Rome. Alone, afraid, and out of costume, he hid in a villa, surrounded by a few loyal slaves. When word came that he was to be arrested, he asked one final question. What an artist dies in me. Then he killed himself. His death was quiet, but his legacy was anything but. Because Nero proved something terrifying, that when an empire stops valuing truth and starts cheering for spectacle, it will trade anything, even its soul, for a show. Rome didn't just let him perform. It needed him to. Because when rot becomes normal, when madness becomes entertaining, and when cruelty is dressed as art, the crowd forgets what decency even looks like. And in time, they begin to enjoy the fall. Before there were orgies in golden palaces or emperors in wedding veils, there was Tiberius. He didn't dress in pearls, he didn't sing on stage, he didn't call himself a goddess. Tiberius was quieter, colder, and somehow even darker. When he came to power in 14 AD, Rome was still mourning Augustus, the man who built the empire. Tiberius was his stepson, a brilliant general and a capable administrator. But he never wanted to rule. Power was forced on him, and it fit him like a chain. At first, he governed with restraint. He kept traditions. He listened to the Senate. He kept his private life. Private. But the mask didn't last. As he grew older, Tiberius began to withdraw from politics, from the people, from Rome itself. Eventually, he left the capital behind and moved to the island of Capri, a place so remote, so high above the sea, that it seemed unreachable by law, by rumor, or by God. At the Villa Jovis, overlooking cliffs and crashing waves, Tiberius built his own world, far from senators, far from judgment, far from the eyes of the city he once served. And that's where the silence began. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind you feel in a locked room, the kind that wraps itself around you like a damp cloth, the kind that hides things. Historians like Suetonius recorded what happened there, though even he struggled to find the words. Tiberius didn't throw feasts, he didn't entertain guests, he collected people, young boys, girls, slaves, servants. He called some of them his little fishes. They were trained to swim between his legs in private pools, to please him like trained pets. Some were taken from noble families, others from conquered towns. None had a choice. Rooms were built for one purpose only. Some had walls painted with images so obscene, even Rome's most decadent elites whispered about them. There were spaces for punishment, for ritual, for the unspeakable. And no one stopped him. Because Tiberius understood something that few emperors truly mastered. You don't rule by being loved, you rule by being feared. Anyone who questioned him vanished. Those who remained in Rome were governed by letters sent from his island. A decree here, a death sentence there. Executions became routine. Paranoia ran wild. People learned to smile with their mouths shut and their hands folded. Tiberius didn't need applause. He didn't need an audience. He had something better. He had silence, but it wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. There was a strategy buried beneath the horror. By forcing noble families to send their sons and daughters to his island, Tiberius created leverage. Humiliated fathers wouldn't rebel. Blackmailed senators stayed loyal. Secrets replaced swords. Capri became less a retreat and more a trap. Even his allies felt it. One of them was a young man named Caligula, sent to live on the island as a boy. He smiled, he obeyed, he learned. Years later, Caligula would rise to power and unleash his own nightmare on Rome. But he didn't invent cruelty. He inherited it from Tiberius. As the emperor aged, his body failed him, but his cruelty sharpened. He rarely spoke. He ate alone. He watched the sea more than he watched the stars. And when he died, in 37 AD, the people of Rome didn't weep. They celebrated, they flooded the streets, they lit fires, they sang songs mocking his name, because his death felt like the lifting of a shadow, one that had stretched from Capri to every home in the empire. But the shadow didn't disappear. Because the silence he created, the fear, the shame, the broken bonds between families and power that never truly left Rome. Tiberius proved that you don't need a stage to perform horror. You don't need crowds to dominate. You don't need applause to rule. Sometimes the most dangerous emperors are the ones who stop speaking, the ones who stop pretending, and the ones who teach the next generation how to hide their violence in plain sight. Tiberius didn't want to be emperor, but once he became one, he never let go. And in the quiet halls of his island palace, he left behind more than memories. He left blueprints. Some historians call it madness, others a system. What do you think? Was this calculated cruelty, or a decaying empire simply showing its true face? Leave your thoughts below. I read every one. Because what came next wasn't just personal, it was sacred. Rome didn't just blur the line between power and pleasure, it erased the line between sex and worship. For most empires, religion is used to keep order. Rules are made. Temples are built. Gods are placed above men to remind them of limits. But Rome did something different. Rome gave its emperors access to the divine, and when men believe they are gods, they start asking for the kinds of offerings only gods would dare request. It began slowly. Statues of Jupiter with exaggerated bodies, fertility festivals where wine flowed freely and boundaries loosened, a few priests dancing in honor of Venus. Nothing too unusual for an ancient city, but over time, something shifted. Temples weren't just places of prayer, they became stages for performance. Offerings didn't come in the form of coins or animals, they came in the form of bodies. One of the most extreme examples was the cult of Priapus, the Roman god of male fertility. His statues were everywhere, in gardens, in shops, even in shrines. He was always shown the same way, naked, smiling, grotesquely exaggerated. He wasn't just a symbol of growth, he was a symbol of dominance, of shamelessness, of conquest. Worshipping him meant participating in rituals that shocked even other Romans. These weren't quiet prayers, they were loud, physical, often public. Then came the Bacchanalia, festivals in honor of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy. What started as private rites became public spectacles. Wine flowed, music played, and what began as celebration often ended in chaos. Orgies broke out in city squares, participants claimed the gods had entered them, and sometimes people never made it home. The Senate tried to ban the Bacchanalia at one point, not because of morality, but because the events became too hard to control, but suppression only made them more desirable. The more dangerous the pleasure, the more sacred it seemed. Even emperors joined in. Elagabalus, already infamous for blurring gender, brought the Syrian sun god Elagabalus to Rome. He didn't just build a temple, he turned it into a sanctuary of sexual ritual. As high priest, he danced in long robes, wore makeup and jewelry, and declared himself the living bride of the god. Ceremonies inside his temple involved offerings of flesh, not metaphorical, but literal. Sacred prostitution wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Women and men alike gave their bodies in worship, believing it brought them closer to divinity. And when the emperor himself took part, who could question it? This fusion of sex and religion spread. In temples to Venus, to Cybele, even to foreign deities brought in through conquest, sacred prostitutes worked full-time. These weren't back-alley encounters, these were holy rites, rituals, offerings to the gods. Rome wrapped it all in gold and incense. Priests wore white. Incantations echoed through marble halls. But beneath the ceremony was something much older, much more primal. Control. Because when you control someone's body and tell them it's holy, you don't just dominate them physically, you dominate their soul. And that's what Rome perfected. They made shame feel like faith. They turned obedience into devotion. And they taught people that surrender wasn't weakness, it was worship. The deeper you gave, the closer you were to the gods. And what could be more Roman than that? This wasn't just spiritual corruption, it was political strategy. Emperors who aligned themselves with divine sexuality became untouchable. Questioning them wasn't just rebellion, it was heresy. They made themselves high priests. They claimed divine marriages, they participated in rituals so bizarre, so intimate, that history often skips over the details. But archaeology doesn't. Temples excavated across the empire show chambers designed for acts no modern church would acknowledge. Paintings, carvings, furniture all point to a world where worship didn't just include sex. It demanded it. Rome taught its people that desire and duty were the same. That to please the emperor, to serve the gods, and to offer your body could all happen in the same breath. And over time people forgot what boundaries used to look like. Children were born into temples, slaves were raised for ritual, and those who questioned it were told they didn't understand the will of the gods. Now, this wasn't freedom, it was grooming. But Rome didn't see it that way. They called it holiness. And in a city where the emperor could do no wrong, what he asked for was always sacred, even if it destroyed the people giving it. That's how empires rot. Not with rage, but with worship. Not with rebellion, but with ritual. Not with cruelty, but with celebration. By the time the temples emptied, the people had already been emptied too. Their shame had been repackaged as pride. Their pain rewritten as devotion. And when the gods finally fell silent, the echoes they left behind were made of heavy silence and broken lives. Rome didn't just fall from war, it collapsed under the weight of all it had declared holy. In the long shadow cast by Rome's emperors, there were women who understood the system better than the men who built it. One of them was Messalina. She was the third wife of Emperor Claudius. Young, beautiful, and by all appearances obedient. But Messalina was no mere ornament of the court. she was its storm. What made her dangerous wasn't her title. It was her intelligence, her ability to see what Rome had become and use it. While Claudius played the role of the scholar king, buried in paperwork and legal codes, Messalina moved in silence. She knew that Rome no longer worshipped restraint, it worshipped appetite, and she was prepared to feed it. At night, she would sneak out of the palace. She wore a wig, changed her voice, and walked the streets not as empress, but as a common prostitute. She worked in brothels under the name Lysiska. Men paid her, not knowing they were sleeping with the emperor's wife. Or perhaps they did, and paid more. This wasn't recklessness, it was calculation. She didn't need the money, she needed the freedom, the power of being untouchable and yet desired. And in Rome, where shame had become currency, Messalina made herself rich in silence. One night, she challenged Rome's most famous prostitute to a contest who could please more men before sunrise. The other woman gave up at 23. Messalina continued past 25. The story spread like wildfire, not because it shocked people, but because it confirmed what they already suspected, that in Rome, the most powerful weren't hiding their indulgence, they were perfecting it. But there was more to Messalina than pleasure. She used sex like a blade, silent, sharp, and often invisible. Through lovers, she gathered secrets. She listened as men whispered ambitions in her ear. She remembered every name, every weakness. And when someone opposed her, she didn't threaten them. She destroyed them, quietly, efficiently, permanently. Generals, senators, even family. Men who displeased her found themselves accused of treason, executed without trial, their estates confiscated, their children orphaned, and all of it arranged by a woman who smiled softly and walked past in silence. Rome never made space for women to rule, so Messalina created her own. But the same hunger that gave her power would one day undo her. She didn't know when to stop. She had taken lovers before, dozens, maybe hundreds, but one man changed everything. Gaius Silius, a young, ambitious senator, handsome, brave, and foolish. Messalina didn't just take him as a lover, she planned to marry him, while still married to the emperor. And it wasn't a secret wedding, it was a full ceremony, with priests, witnesses, and rituals. Some historians believe it was meant as a coup, that she was preparing to remove Claudius and make Silius emperor. Others say it was madness, but in Rome, the line between the two had always been thin. When Claudius heard the news, he didn't shout. He didn't wait. He signed the death order. Messalina tried to flee. She hid in the gardens where she had once arranged banquets and whispered secrets to allies. The guards found her crouched in silence, shaking. Even then, she didn't scream. A soldier raised his sword, and just like that, it was over. She was no older than 28. Rome moved on, it always did. Claudius remarried, the palace was cleaned, new laws were passed, but something lingered in the air, something about what Messalina had revealed. She had shown that sex wasn't just a vice, it was a language, one that could be used to seduce, to manipulate, to destroy. She had shown that women didn't need armies to rule. They only needed to be underestimated. And she had shown that in a world where shame had no place, seduction could become statecraft. Messalina didn't fall because she broke the rules. She fell because she reminded Rome that the rules no longer mattered. She became a mirror. And the empire didn't like what it saw. Not every horror in Rome wore silk or sat on a throne. Some were quieter, colder, systemic. For all its talk of law, virtue, and order, Rome's power was built on something much simpler. Ownership, of land, of goods, of people. The Roman Empire ran on slavery, not just as a byproduct of conquest, but as an institution woven into every part of daily life. Wealthy families owned dozens, sometimes hundreds. Slaves were cooks, builders, tutors, and for many, playthings. Rome didn't see slaves as human beings. They were tools, investments, property to be bought, sold, used, and discarded. And nowhere was that more horrifying than in the empire's appetite for sexual control. Some slaves were trained solely for pleasure, taken as children, conditioned as they grew, groomed into silence, not for love, not for companionship, but for obedience. There were no laws to protect them. Under Roman law, a slave could not legally refuse sexual demands from their master. Consent didn't exist, pain wasn't punished, trauma wasn't acknowledged. And when Roman citizens wanted something more exotic, something that blurred the line between human and symbol, they turned to eunuchs. Boys were bought young, often under 10 years old. Their families, desperate or deceived, sold them into the trade. In back rooms of the empire's underbelly, surgeons performed the castrations. There were no doctors, no anesthesia, no mercy. Some procedures removed only the testes, others took everything. The more extreme the modification, the higher the price on the market. Most didn't survive. The death rate was staggering. Some estimate that more than half of the boys didn't make it. Those who did were often left with lifelong complications, infections, incontinence, chronic pain. But the survivors, they were worth fortunes. In the imperial palace, eunuchs served as personal attendants, private companions, and, frequently, objects of desire. Their altered bodies were considered safe. A man could lie with one without fear of pregnancy, without fear of scandal, without fear of rebellion, because what could be more controllable than someone whose very identity had been cut away? The demand grew so high that entire industries were formed around it. Trade routes were built, middlemen profited, there were catalogues and slave brokers and whispers in the court about which child had the softest voice or the quietest eyes. It wasn't just the emperors, senators bought them, merchants rented them, priests justified them. Rome had turned suffering into its system, and what made it more terrifying was how ordinary it became. You could pass a slave market on your way to the forum, hear a child scream behind a curtain while buying bread, attend a banquet where the entertainment was dressed in gold chains and a hollow stare, and no one looked twice, because when cruelty is efficient, it doesn't feel like cruelty anymore, it feels like tradition. Even Rome's most admired leaders took part. Julius Caesar was rumored to have kept male concubines. Augustus passed laws promoting sexual discipline among citizens while keeping slaves for his own pleasure. It was everywhere. In the bathhouses, in the temples, in the homes of the noble and the mouths of the poets. Sex wasn't private in Rome. It was structured, commercialized, standardized, and the cost was paid in bodies, in broken children, in silent adults, in generations that knew their purpose wasn't to live but to be used. Modern minds often imagine Rome through marble statues and military banners, through scrolls and speeches and architecture. But beneath it all was a machine fueled by human lives, by children whose futures were stolen in backrooms, by women sold with contracts signed in blood, by boys whose voices never deepened because someone decided their silence was more profitable than their song. And the machine never paused because it worked. It kept the empire moving, kept the elite satisfied, kept the illusion alive that civilization could thrive, even as its soul rotted beneath the marble. No emperor ruled alone. They were carried to their thrones on the backs of the mutilated. Their dinners were served by trembling hands, their baths drawn by those who had no names, their nights filled by those who could not say no. And every time the sun rose over Rome, the machine turned again. We like to believe empires fall with a bang, that one day everything collapses, the sky darkens, the people rebel, the palace burns, the tyrant falls. But that's not how Rome died. It didn't go up in flames, it dissolved, slowly, quietly, behind closed doors, under golden ceilings, between whispered lies and silent screams. And by the time the marble cracked, the rot had already spread too far to stop. Rome taught the world that power could be dressed as art, that cruelty could hide behind tradition, that control wasn't about weapons, it was about rituals, silence, and shame. It showed how pleasure could be law, how identity could be shaped to fit a ruler's will, how sex, when wielded like a weapon, could govern not just the body, but the mind, the home, and the state. That blueprint never vanished, it just changed hands. Today we don't call it empire, but the shadows look familiar. Scandals made into entertainment, pain turned into currency, dignity lost for applause, children trained for systems they don't understand, leaders who demand loyalty not for how they serve, but for how they dominate. We call it progress, but we've seen this before. Like, you watched it unfold in temples, in brothels, in golden palaces, in velvet-lined torture. Rome didn't die. It became the ghost in the system. And every time a society forgets where the line was between public and private, between worship and abuse, between performance and truth, that ghost returns. If you've felt like something is wrong, you're not imagining it. You're remembering something your ancestors once tried to survive. And if history has a voice, it isn't shouting, it's whispering. We've been here before. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because remembering isn't just about the past. It's about protecting what's still worth saving. And if you feel like shouting into the void, start with a comment. I'll be there, listening.